the discussion today is about what we're doing in the garden during fall. And I think every time you run across one, ask them a question. If it's exactly the same question and you ask it of 6 experts, you're probably going to get 6 slightly different or drastically different answers, depending, because their background has so much to do, with the way we approach these issues. Enough that I realize more than one good answer to any given question, depending on how you feel about it. I have a little bit different viewpoint. I see conventional agriculture and gardening practices with the use of chemical inputs to soil, and particularly petrochemical fungicides and insecticides and so on, that sort of approach, as being, by and large, 19th century science that refused to die during the 20th century because it was very profitable for some large corporations. And then it became institutionalized because they support the agricultural colleges. I see organic gardening as something that has very old roots, of course. Putting down horse poop around your cabbages goes way back, but it was refined and reviewed during the late 20th century, probably from the late 1930s onward. I see organic agriculture or gardening as being only partially correct. It's still, I think, in the process of evolution and is gradually becoming in the 21st century what we would call permaculture today. That word still doesn't define when I'm typing on Google. It always comes up as spelling error because we're not quite there yet with it. But permaculture would be attempting to emulate the natural systems of the planet and utilize what it is. I mean, the simplest way to put it, you go into a redwood forest here in California, you walk around and you see ferns, you see redwood oxalis, you see wild ginger, you see the redwood trees and the animals and so on, and nobody runs around with a bag of fertilizer, right? Yet you get the biggest living vegetables on the face of the planet doing their own thing. So, I mean, with that in mind, obviously, it means it is possible to do what you're trying to do in your own gardens or in your own farms without having to drag in tremendous amounts of input from the outside. This is where organic gardening becomes somewhat flawed from my point of view, in that organic gardening has constantly relied on the importation of materials from outside sources to enhance the situation where you're working. Well, that causes just 2 problems from my point of view. They're flawed. One, wherever it came from, it should have gone back to, because you've created a deficit somewhere else. There's an imbalance in that practice. Also, often when you import materials, you will bring with them things that you didn't intend to bring with. So that's where the idea of, if you're working in a given area, of producing what it is that's needed for the area within the area by using fungi, bacteria, plants, and so on, is really my ideal point of view. You all have a garden going out here right now. I'm sure in your backyards you have gardens that are operating currently. The first thing I recommend at this time of the year is play God. That's what I call it, at least. You got stuff that's out there that's kind of hanging in, and you go, poor little tomato, make another, It's like, do it in. Just, bite the bullet and do what you have to do to get that stuff out for 2 reasons. One is that those old, weak, struggling crops often harbor and develop diseases that you didn't want. If you leave the tomatoes in too long, they're bound to get some kind of disease you can't cure. So you take them out in time and rotate to a different crop. They also take up space in the garden. Working with time and space in the garden is a very important issue. Okay, it's like it's time to get the tomatoes out. It's time to get the cabbages in, as an example. And so, if you wait too long, the soil heat drops, and once the soil heat goes away, you can't get those little seeds and plants off to a good start. A lot of things that might just sort of, kind of hang in there through the winter and then take off first thing in spring need to be put in now, or even yesterday, So I'd say fall planting approach is taken on starting in August. And so if you are trying to grow your own onion plants, for instance, it's a lovely thing to do here in the wintertime. They're generally pest-free. They're wonderful. Garlic is the other one too that goes in at this time of year. August is the time for starting the onion seed, as I mentioned, if you're going to do the seed yourself. If you're not going to do it yourself, and if you're going to buy it either in 6-packs or in transplants, in bundles, then now right now, between now and Thanksgiving, you want to get your process done. The onion, because it's a bulb, is more tolerant to later planting than things like carrot seed, which really needs about 65 degrees soil temperature to take off. You can put carrots in the fall too, and they won't be ripened during the winter, but they'll be there first thing in spring before your tomatoes come on. See, and so when you're dealing with this whole thing with garlic or onions, I used to put the onion rows in usually during October and November, or the garlic rows into the garden, and then come April, I'd go through, I'd do one last fertilizing on those crops, work the rows between them where we've been walking all winter, and then put corn seed down in the walk rows, because the onions wouldn't be ready to pull out, or the garlic's not ready to take out until June. But the corn wouldn't be till, well, about the knee at that point, and you'd have weeds again. And so by taking out the onions and garlic, I got rid of the weeds between the corn, and we managed to get 2 crops out of the same property. Sometimes you have to overlap things in creative ways to get this to happen, unless you have unlimited space. Another thing about the fall, I assume most people involved here with LEAF or have come today are kind of green mentality people. You're looking towards protecting the planet, not wasting resources, recycling everything you can, and so on. At least I hope you are. Fall gardening here in California, I mean, this is it. This is as green as it gets, because we don't need to use water. Water is a very valuable resource on the planet. And the Nursery Association in California has spent millions of dollars over decades attempting to convince the consumer that in California, fall is the season for gardening. Okay? Failed completely. Californians who think that they're, ahead of the pack and they create the ideas for the rest of the country and, Walt Disney rules and so on. We actually follow the people in Minneapolis into the garden every year, generally around here. And no one gets excited until the tomato plants come out on the table. And they go, oh, it's time to garden, Well, that was past, actually. But truly, we can garden 12 months out of the year here in one capacity or another. There's always something to be doing here in a garden that's productive. And you can't have tomatoes, melons, sweet corn, and snap beans in November. Not planting. You're not planting them in November. But you have to work with those during the warm season of the year here. But in most of the country, what we call growing season, frost-free growing season, and not growing season when frost comes, these are the determining criteria for when we go in and out of a garden. Okay. We start planting in Minnesota in the beginning of spring as the frosts are diminishing from winter and the soil's warming up, and we give up with the whole process when the frost starts killing the pumpkins, and it's over. The snow covers it, and that's the end of the roll. Here in California, things don't fit that paradigm, because we live in a Mediterranean climate, which to define means a climate that's got a distinct rainy and dry season every year. And we can count on it. Y'all know what time it rains and when it doesn't here, right? It's like clockwork almost. Even under the weirdest of weather conditions, it's still wet in the winter and dry in the summer. Well, plants need moisture. And our frosts here are so small, really, when they do come most of the time, that they don't amount to much, especially when we're working with the right crop at the right time of year. And so the frost-free growing season is not as much of an issue in this area as when the water comes. Because when the water comes is the time to do it. If you're trying to do most of your planting in the beginning of spring, you're coming into the longest dry, hot period of the year, and that's when your plants usually suffer. And people always ask me, but Bill, how much water does it need? Well, if you plant it now, none. Forget it. Don't even worry about it unless winter goes crazy and we don't get a drop of rain, then you have to concern. But so planting now is easy, and so if you're thinking about putting in roses, fruit trees, shrubs of some kind, and perennials and other permanent type plantings that might be there for years, always focus on the fall and the winter here. That's the time.